Thank you.
Good evening and welcome back to our final lesson in Daniel, Hope for the Faithful. We are finishing our series tonight with a lesson on the very last portion of chapter 12. So it's the epilogue to the final vision and sort of the epilogue to the book. And then we're going to talk about how Jesus referenced Daniel, how he pulled the content from Daniel into his teaching. And then we'll have some time to just discuss what has struck you in this study, what's made a difference to you, what have you learned, and what has been meaningful. So that's our agenda for tonight. Um, let's start by reviewing our lesson from last week. Last week we had a super full lesson because we looked at that final vision that goes from the beginning of chapter 10 all the way through 12:4. And there were two parts. In the first part, Daniel had an encounter with an angel. So we had kind of some takeaways for what that tells us about the spiritual realm. What did you notice?
Wasn't this the one where the angel was detained for a time and he was battling with how was he put? Like the prince of
Yeah, he calls him a prince. It seems to be another angelic being. Yes, it's a very puzzling section. It's a little mysterious.
Mhm.
But we took from that there are spiritual beings who are in battle for God's purposes, and somehow there are spiritual beings who are against God's purposes, and that the battle in heaven parallels the battle on earth. And we talked about like how much of this is beyond our understanding versus being like are there literal like you know beings that we could picture. What do they look like? Do they look like, the person in this vision looked very shiny. Remember, he had fiery eyes and a shiny, he looked like a gemstone, and he had a gold belt, and all these shiny elements. Are those metaphorical? We don't know exactly. What we do know is that in whatever form these spiritual forces, beings take, they are real, and that the battle is relevant to us as Christians. We talked about how Paul said our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the authorities, the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So somehow there are real spiritual beings who are opposed to us and real spiritual beings who are for us. Yeah, what else?
Well, we had this very historically correct accounting of 400 years, which we read the first paragraph of.
Yes, yeah. So, okay, so finishing it, so thinking about chapter 10 and that encounter with the angel, I think a couple other like takeaways would be that the sending of that angel was occasioned by Daniel's prayers. So in some way, our prayers do make a difference. They are a force in the battle of good and evil. So there is a battle going on, and our prayers matter. So we take that away, and we take away that God is for us, and there is incredible strength on our side. Okay, so then the angel comes and he's like, I've come to bring you a vision. And then he spews this incredibly long and detailed vision, right? And we just read the first part, but we saw how it fit right with the history. There was we're tracking the same period in history that we saw in the vision in chapter 7, in the vision in chapter 8, in the little slice with the angel at the end of chapter 9. So we're getting a sense of repetition, right? These visions are building on the same time period, and we're sort of like diving in, like you were on Google Earth and you're like going in closer, 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 right? You're diving into this focus period on the Ptolemaic Seleucid Wars, and specifically the period of Antiochus IV. So we saw that.
Mhm.
And then we saw after this period of very high historical correlation, beginning in verse 40, we get some different kind of material. It seems to be, it departs from the historical record as best we can tell. And so we think that is some sort of imagined or stylized version of the death of Antiochus. So that what we're seeing is like it happens in some way that is not yet detailed out like the rest of the history was detailed out, and yet it happens according to God's will and God's timing, so that God will bring Antiochus's evil power to an end. And that's been a theme of Daniel, hasn't it? We then moved into some final material that sort of overlaid the conversation about the end of Antiochus's evil power with a conversation about the end of all evil powers at the close of history, right? So if we think of the sweep of history as from creation to new creation, whenever the biblical authors begin to talk about a time when God comes and sets things right, right? Be it the Exodus or the end of the power of Babylon or the end of the power of Antiochus IV. Whenever they talk about a time of reckoning where God is going to come and set things right and bring justice, they have overtones and undertones. There's all this intermixing with the time at the end of all things when God will set everything right. And so we begin to see conversation about the righteous will rise, and those who are wordings that we hear about the end days when God puts everything under the feet of Jesus. And those get mixed when the biblical authors talk about an instance of God setting it right. We hear echoes of the final setting it right. Does that make sense? Okay, that we a lot of Daniel starts to make sense when we think of it that way. How Jesus uses Daniel will make more sense when we think of it that way. So that's our prep for tonight's final lesson. So someone read Daniel 12 verses 5 through 13.
I'll read.
Thank you.
Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on this bank of the stream, and one on the bank of, and one on that bank of the stream. And someone said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream, how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time, and that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished. I heard, but I did not understand. Then I said, O my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? He said, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. But those who are wise shall understand. And from the time that the regular burnt offerings is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is our last scene in verse 5. Who does Daniel see?
Are there three people? That's kind of confusing.
Yeah, I think so. I think what we have is the man in linen is the angel from chapter 10, the very sparkly guy that he's been talking to this whole time that gave him strength so many times. Um, and in addition to the man in linen, he sees two others. So I think we're talking about two more celestial beings, two more angels, and they're on either side of the river, right? They're like guards at a door on either side of the river. Um, we notice like this. I noticed yours said stream. It's a different word for river. It could be translated stream or channel. So this sort of begins to remind us of the vision in chapter 8, where they were by the Ulai Canal. And as we go through this vision, we're going to see a bunch of echoes of the vision in chapter 8, right? This is something the author of Daniel has done over and over, right? Take one scene and insert into it or highlight a bunch of elements from the scenes before, right? So the author is closing the loop by the sort of the beginning of the Hebrew section of Daniel and to the end of the Hebrew section of Daniel, right? We've seen a bunch of structural kind of literary patterns in Daniel. Remember, there's a Hebrew frame, chapter 1, and then 8 through 12 around an Aramaic section. We saw in the Aramaic material, it went A, B, C, C, B, A. So why? And then there's all these callbacks, all these connections where he pulls these same elements, repeated elements through. Why do these literary points matter? Why have we been pointing these out?
Because it means something if you repeat it.
Yeah, there's some sense of emphasis. Yeah. What were you saying, Bethany?
I think it kind of goes back to that whole cyclical thing, but you see a progression in the cycle where you're coming closer to the culmination or the end.
Yeah. Yeah, the author's using it as a tool to say these same things happen over and over, but God is making a progression to the end. Yeah, I love that. They are this is literary artistry, right? This is very artfully done when we start to see all of these connections and structural elements. And I think whenever an artist does something elegantly, we want to take the opportunity to notice and enjoy it, right? God provides us a beautiful literary art here. And just like all of the artistry that we see, it's good to enjoy it. And I think it also tells us how intentionally this work is written, right? So when there are elements that we go, well, I don't understand that, and there are some in Daniel, right? More than in other books, and there are some in our passage tonight. We can still approach the work with confidence that it is how it's supposed to be because this is beautifully and carefully written. And so we may not quite understand it, but yet we know that there is an intelligent uh, design at work here. So I think that's part of why we've been careful to point those out as we go along. All right, in verse, let's see, what is it? 6. What does one of the angels ask?
How long shall it be till the end of these wonders?
How long, right? Your translation says wonders, which is a good translation because it's a single word. Some others will say astonishing things because it can be used for good wonders and bad wonders, right? We think of all the wonders as good wonders, but this can be used for the astonishingly devastating works of Antiochus the Fourth, right? And it has been in some previous chapters, this same word. So how long till
Great.
all
How
these
long?
bad wonders
Mhm.
happens, right? Would you say I missed it?
Oh, I was saying that that whole phrase, how long, has been repeated before when they're talking about Antiochus and the desecration and how long will you let this go?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a echo of chapter 8, another echo of chapter 8, where it was again celestial being to celestial being. How long? It's the cry of lament, right? It's the cry in the Psalms. How long, O Lord, will the suffering last, right? It's in some way, this is the prompting question of the book of Daniel. How long will God let evil continue? And in some ways, this is the question of human existence, right? If there's a good God, why is there evil? And why are you letting it go on and continue to have its way? Right. And so we see, this question is in the mouth of the angels, where they too are suffering alongside us. It's the idea that God participates with us in our suffering. And that cry is perfectly acceptable for us to ask. How long, oh Lord? Yeah, questions or comments? Okay, so now we've got the man dressed in linen, who we think is the very sparkly angel of chapter 10. Maybe they're all that sparkly.
Mm-mm.
And he seems on how to interpret this. Some have said upstream, but waiting for it says my connection is unstable. Okay.
You keep breathing.
Okay. Some have said upstream, but most have said he's above the water, like he's floating in the middle, right? And what does he do? Yeah, hand to heaven, right? What does it mean? What does it mean in English if I say hand to heaven? What is that? Y'all don't hear
You're
that?
taking
Nobody
a vow, like you're swearing.
a
Like an
vow,
oath.
swearing.
Oh, yeah.
An oath, right? And he says he gives an oath here. I heard him swear by him who lives forever. So he's an oath by God, is what he's giving. So he's giving an answer, which answers are good, but what kind of answer is it?
Vague.
Confusing, cryptic,
Figurative.
Okay, right? It's time, times, and half a time, right? We have seen this before. This was in chapter 7 in verse 25. For the period that the saints of the highest one will be given into the hand of the horn, the final horn. This is an cryptic and apocalyptic genre typical way of saying three and a half something, right? A time, two times, and half a time, three and a half, which we take to be 3.5 years. Now, if we try to, there are 3 calendars in use at this time, and if we say, well, how many days is that? Then we can have multiple figures. None of them, it turns out, exactly match the figures of days given later. What figures do we have in verse 11 and 12?
1290
1290.
and 1335.
1335, right? Okay. And then way back in chapter 8,
23.
what's that?
2300.
Yes, in chapter 8, we had that 2300, which we decided was probably 2300 sacrifices that happened morning and evening, so maybe 1150 days. Okay. They're all different numbers of days. The shortest one is 1150. The longest is 1335. That all the figures that might be 3.5 years are right in the middle. But they're all within 185 days of each other. They're all within 6 months of each other. So we have multiple figures that are all approximately 3.5 years. Bethany.
I don't know how familiar you are with this, but around the time that Daniel would have supposedly been written, the calendar year is from March into December. And basically January and February are just like this dark time that don't exist.
No man's land. They don't count.
I mean, there are days there, but they're not accounted for. They're just not accounted for. Like the January to December calendar doesn't begin. It's not created until the Romans, like deep into the Romans. So I'm curious how a counting of a calendar year would take into account those missing.
I am not familiar with that. I did find that there's three. So the research I did said there's 3 calendars in use at this time: a 28-day lunar calendar, a 30-day lunar calendar, and a 364-day solar calendar. Then, of course, a modern solar calendar is 365 and a quarter days.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see anything about leaving out those, and maybe that starts to make sense of something. But then we still wouldn't understand why what is happening in 1,290 days versus 1,300. So this is one of those things that we could talk about more. So let's talk about a few options that scholars think. Some scholars think those 2 final figures are supposed to be in parallel, and the difference is a copying error, and they're supposed to be the same number. That does not make sense to me because the second number has like 2 extra words in it. These are written out. They don't have numerals. They're written out in like letter words. So having 2 extra words that have completely different letters in them, that like, it's not like they were copied from the previous line like you sometimes will see, like, just can't make sense of that. Some scholars think that the 1,290 days came and went and nothing happened. So someone came back in and added 1,335 days, and then that came and went and nothing happened. And so somebody added in until the end. I don't think that makes sense because all of this seems to have been written intentionally, and the abomination that causes desolation is already set up, it seems, in the time. If you take the later writing of Daniel, that it's written in the period of Antiochus and Epiphanes, then it's already set up when they're writing this. So they could put the right number, and then I think, well, am I thinking too Western? Then I'm thinking right. It's very hard for me to put myself in a different mindset than my like modern Western view of accuracy. But I still don't think that makes sense. And then some scholars think that each of these numbers was to point to a slightly different milestone. There's a lot happening in this period, right? Many things are occurring, and that these could all refer to slightly different events. So if these are meant to be exact figures, and I think that's probably what's going on, but it's very difficult to nail down what events they are possibly pointing to. And I think if we think back, remember how the 70 years, Jeremiah talking about one thing, Jeremiah talking about another thing, Zechariah and the chronicler all said 70 years, but they were talking about different event periods, and none of them were exactly 70 years, right? This is a common way to use numbers in this period. It's not a modern Western way to use numbers, but it is a normal, truthful way to use numbers in this period. And so I think that may be what's going on. All of these are around 3.5 years. And somehow the point is that it will happen, and it will happen in God's timing. What exactly these numbers mean is left as a mystery. and some scholars think they have figured out, but then others argue. And so rather than trying to present possibilities, that's where I kind of landed. Questions or comments? Yeah, Amy.
Why Do they give specific numbers? And why do they even talk about it when he says these words are secret and sealed up?
Right. Right. Yes. And why, if these numbers are symbolic, what's the symbolism here? 70 was an easy number to see the symbolism of. One of my commentaries says, here are two perplexing calculations that must have made sense to the original readers of the book, but have thoroughly confounded modern interpreters. So I think you ask an excellent question. Sadly, I have no answer.
I mean, because he didn't even have to do this in front of Daniel. It's so confusing.
Yeah.
They didn't have to tell Daniel.
He didn't have to say any numbers. So that's where I come at it like, well, whatever it means, there's something intentional happening here. I don't think coming at it going, these are probably just mistakes, is sensible, because the whole book is written so intentionally. And, if something was wrong, someone could have just edited it, right? They could have chosen like, let's scratch that out and put this in, if they wanted to. But instead, it stands as a whole. And so I think there's something going on here. I just don't think we entirely understand what. A fitting point to make in our final on Daniel, because we've had those moments, right? I think here we're seeing reflections of the themes that we discussed, right? Our first theme was kings and kingdoms. And here we're seeing, however, when whatever timing God intends, human kingdoms are meant to rule under the sovereign rule of God, which is our second theme, and the sovereign rule of God will prevail in the end. God raises up kingdoms and he brings them down, and he will bring this one, which is evil and abusive, down. That's what will happen. The timing, very confusing, which sometimes we live in a world where the timing we live in is confusing as well. Then I think our third theme is about mysteries, right? God reveals mysteries, and yet many of them remain mysterious. And we have seen that all the way across Daniel, that we can understand so much of it, but not all of it. And even Daniel, look what Daniel says in verse 8. I heard, but I did not understand, right? We have Daniel, this holy person, this righteous and good person. He's been presented as good all the way through, and he's presented as being given understanding, right? Even in 10:1, it says the understanding of the message came to him, as if he had understanding. But he doesn't have all the understanding. We don't ever fully understand. And so we see that we are living there ourselves. We understand part of what is given, and then some things remain mysterious. Then we get the final kind of thematic statement of the book here. In verse 10, many will be purified, made spotless and refined. So this is the sense of the faithful, right? This is what the faithful will be made pure. The wicked will continue to be wicked, right? We've seen that. We see that in our world today. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. And so the wise ones, these wise ones showed up in the very beginning, where Daniel and his friends through chapter 11. We saw the wise ones will bring understanding to many. They will be refined, purified, and made spotless until the end of time. And then in chapter 12, verse 3, those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. And so there is this final encouragement to be one of the wise, to be one of the faithful, to remain faithful to the end. So I think I've sort of highlighted the 4 themes of Daniel that we talked about at the beginning. We're seeing all of those come through all the way to the end. Any questions or comments on that? All right, so we see, this whole world of Daniel's visions, right? Multiple visions. They follow along and they focus on this idea of the abomination that causes desolation as like the pinnacle of the evil kingdom, right? And we saw how the Son of Man, it's this scene in chapter 7 where the Son of Man comes in. Let's look at that. Turn over to chapter 7. We'll read verse 13, but the setup here is that there's a scene in heaven where the Ancient of Days, God is on his throne in front of with the heavenly council, and the books are opened. It becomes a courtroom scene, right? As the books are opened and a verdict is given. And the verdict is that these beasts, remember, these beasts are coming out of the chaos sea. They're causing evil, and they are stripped of their power and destroyed. And in comes verse 13. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man. So looking like a human being, and yet we know he's more than a human being. Coming with the clouds of heaven. Usually God rides in on the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days. So he does appear to be a different person than the Ancient of Days, and was led into his presence, and he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples and nations and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion was an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Okay, so what do we learn about the Son of Man? He's like a human being. What else?
They can stand in the presence of the Ancient of Days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he approaches the Ancient of Days. And more than that, what else?
He's given sovereignty and power and dominion.
He's worshipped.
Yeah, so
the kingdom has no end.
Okay, all right. So the power is stripped to the beast and given to the Son of Man, and he is worshiped. Who is worthy of worship?
God.
God alone, right? Hear, O Israel, you shall have no other gods before me. Worship the Lord your God and him only. So like only God gets worshiped. And yet here, Ancient of Days is on the throne, Son of Man receives worship. There's something going on here, right? The Jews, by the time of Jesus' day, regarded this as a messianic passage, and it's about identity and authority. God, in some way, because he's worshipped, authority given the dominion taken from all of the evil kingdoms that didn't reign in God's way. So we have this image of identity and authority. Okay. Now turn over to Mark. I chose Mark. There are parallel passages to these in the other Gospels. We could do this in any of the Gospels, but because we studied Mark more recently, and the fascinating thing is that Jesus, this is the most common title Jesus uses for himself, but it isn't a nickname or a way to vary his word choice, right? It appears very specifically. So I made a little list and I want to share it. If I can share a screen here. Okay. The title Son of Man, Jesus uses for himself, and it shows up in 11 passages. All these passages are something significant, something really important for Jesus's identity and authority, right? This first passage, the friends let the paralytic down through the roof, and Jesus makes a point that he can heal him, but he can also forgive sins. right? That you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. This is all about Jesus. Who can forgive sins but God alone? They respond. So here we've got the title Son of Man, first use in the Gospel of Mark, right at this question of identity, authority. Who is Jesus and what can he do? Right. Next, Jesus goes along and he works by picking grain and eating it on the Sabbath. And he says that you may know the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, right? Identity and authority right there. Then when we go to Mark 8, the center section of Mark is Jesus's journey to Jerusalem, right? He's headed towards his crucifixion in Jerusalem. And he has that section is structured around 3 predictions of the passion, 3 predictions that he will be going to die. And in each prediction, he uses this Son of Man title. It comes out in each one. Comes out at the close of the transfiguration. Shining face on a mountain with Moses and Elijah. There's an identity and authority passage, right? He uses it as he says that he came to give his life as a ransom for many. And then it shows up in the Last Discourse when he says, they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, right? Straight out of Daniel 7. At the Last Supper, as he predicts his betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he goes to meet his betrayer, and to the high priest to say that he is, in fact, the Christ. So every one of these is significant, right? He pulls on this title, Son of Man, to say dominion is going to be given to him. He is worthy of worship. All this means God and King. So when we see Jesus using this passage from Daniel, every time he's making this huge claim that he is both God and King. Questions on this before we look at a couple of passages specifically? I had not noticed until I did this search. I knew he used the Son of Man in these passages. I didn't know it was every single one and only these, right? Never casually, never just in conversation, right? It's always at the one, and he's always making a statement. I thought that was so cool. If we go to chapter 8, this is the first prediction of the passion. And earlier in the prediction begins in 31, but right before that, Peter has said what? If you're in Mark 8, look back at 29 and 30.
You are the Christ.
The Messiah, yeah.
Yeah, this identification of Jesus as God and King, although they just don't know what that means. And so what Jesus does, he takes this title that is a title of triumph and victory, and then he tells them, verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man, God and King, triumph and victory, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And so Jesus is taking this title of power and overlaying it with his own humility, right? Rule and suffering. And he's saying, actually, these go together. This image of the Son of Man in Daniel coming in triumph was in the midst of the suffering of the holy people. We can understand that more in depth. We have done all those visions more thoroughly, right? We've learned about Antiochus and how he had treated the Jews, and we see like the suffering of the holy people was deep, and it was accompanied by the suffering of the angelic beings battling along beside them. And Jesus says, I'm coming in triumph, but also in suffering, and my victory will be through death. So he takes this image of the Son of Man and adds to it with what the nature of God is to suffer alongside his people and for his people. It's a lot to pack in by using this term out of Daniel, because it sort of like Easter eggs all of Daniel into the passages in the Gospels. Questions or comments? Let's move to Mark 13. This is often called the Last Discourse. There's a parallel to it in Matthew and Luke. And it's in a section where Jesus has been teaching over and over again that I'm going to turn this off. There we go. That the old order is finished, right? He's been saying that the leaders of Israel have failed you. Well, isn't that parallel to our section in Daniel where we see that the regimes that God assigned power have failed and used that power badly? And he's saying the old leaders of Israel have failed and their time is done. He's talking about the era of the temple being over. It's going to wither like a fig tree that doesn't bear any fruit, right? He uses that as like this prophetic object lesson in chapter 11, this withering of the fig tree. Yesterday I was teaching this, but I could not for the life of me come up with the words object lesson. I tried. I was like, what is it when teachers have like a example thing, prop thing? And everybody just looked at me. I'm like, y'all are teachers. A bunch of you taught school. Come on, help me out. Object lesson. Okay, so beginning of chapter. So he's been saying the era of the temple is done. Y'all, it's done. The leaders are done. They're all done. And then beginning verse 1 of chapter 13, the disciples are like, look how awesome the temple is. So then you're like, were you not listening? Everything Jesus was saying was about the temple being done. Did you not hear that? And I think what we're hearing is resistance, right? That's bad news for people who care about the temple. And so they're like, but aren't these stones great? And that's why Jesus says, not one will be left on another. Because this is the heart of the message, that God is bringing another of these reckonings like God did in Daniel. And that's why in this passage in Mark 13, we get these scenes from Daniel recreated in what Jesus says. Let's look at the structure of the whole thing before we go into those scenes. First of all, he starts out, and in the middle says, and at the end he says, so 3 times Jesus says, don't be deceived. You have to be on your guard against deception. It's watch out that no one, verse 5, watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and will deceive many. And when you hear wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Then in verse 21, at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or look, there he is, don't believe it. False Christs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and miracles to deceive the elect, if that were possible. And then in verse 32, no one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard. Be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each one to his assigned task, and tells them at the door to keep watch. And then he continues, and the focus is on, I say to everyone, watch. So beginning, middle, and end, we get a message that you're not going to figure it all out, right? So that's part of why I don't think the point of Daniel is to figure out all those numbers, right? And we're not going to use them to figure out when Jesus is coming back, or when someone had an example in class where they'd gotten an email saying that they could figure out from prophecies in the Bible that the stock market was going to crash on Friday. It's like, I don't think that's what the Bible is for. And that's kind of what Jesus is telling you, is that people are going to say, I can use this to predict, but that's not what we're supposed to be doing with it. What we're supposed to be doing is staying awake to the work of God, staying awake to the purposes of Jesus in our lives, in the, the missions of God in the world, right? So we don't know the time of day. He says beginning, middle, and end. But then he also talks about how you're going to be, verse 9, you'll be handed over to local councils. You'll be flogged in the synagogues. You'll stand before governors. You'll be arrested and brought to trial. Brother will betray brother unto death. These are the things that happened in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. And Jesus says so he draws on that prior, and he says it will happen again. And we think specifically, trying to wait for my internet connection to stabilize a little bit. We think specifically Jesus refers to the destruction of the temple by the Romans in AD 70. So just after, in the time that we studied in the gospel, in Acts, we see that there were these elements of rebellion brewing, and they came to a head just after this period, and Rome came in and just flattened Jerusalem in AD 70. And so some of what Jesus is talking about, flee to those who are in Judea should flee to the mountains. That's saying like, Jerusalem won't be your safe place. Sorry. You have to go elsewhere. Jerusalem will not be safe for you. And we have his lament for how hard that will be on nursing mothers and pregnant women. I think we see Jesus' compassion for women there. So all of that would happen in AD 70. So he's using Daniel's story and he's talking about something to come. But we get this same effect where he also overlays the reckoning that will come at the end of all things, right? Look here in verse 24. In those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And at that time, men will see the Son of Man, right? This is straight out of Daniel, isn't it? The earlier little verses out of Isaiah, and those lines are repeated. The first line is repeated in other prophets as well. At that time, men will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his chosen ones from the four winds. Sounds like our prophecies of Daniel, right? The four winds. And from the ends of the earth and to the ends of the heavens. And so we get a scene of, yes, there's coming this suffering and reckoning, and in the end there will be a complete reckoning where all things are set right. It testifies to the pattern of God's work. Paige?
Doesn't the Revelation also say that those days will be dreadful for pregnant women and nursing mothers?
Yes, Jesus laments that. The Revelation laments that. It's a pattern that we see in the prophets. Just recognizing that the vulnerable often are hurt the most by suffering times, and that God cares about that. Yeah. So I think, Jesus's end goal here is to tell them, yes, this is coming, but to tell them what is his point out of all of this?
His point is to be alert, be ready, and live in the now, to God's work now.
Yeah. It's the same point that Daniel brings us, right? Be faithful, be one of the wise ones, right? Be the ones who keep watch. And a lot of Jesus' parables focus on this, right? That God is offering you an opportunity to be his person and to live in his way. And it's time to take the opportunity. And so the encouragement towards faithfulness is what stands out of all of this.
It reminds me too, a lot of these things we see even today, like brother against brother.
Yeah, nations rise against, definitely. Yeah. What else? So I think that's such a great point that we have definitely seen about Daniel is how timely it has felt. Have you felt that way? Seems like this idea that evil powers continue so long, and we cry out to God, how long? And we know that He will be faithful to bring justice in the end. That is a timely message. What else has struck you about this book? There's a fly in here. It is dive bombing my ears. It's driving me crazy.
Okay. In my little commentary, it's talking about 12:13. It says, Daniel stands tall in the gallery of God's remarkable servants. Born of royal heritage, yet taken into captivity when only a teenager, Daniel determined to remain faithful to God in the land of his captivity. Even at great personal cost, Daniel spent his entire lifetime advising his captors with unusual wisdom. God chose him as his servant to record some of the events of the captivity and some significant events concerning the future. As an old man, having been faithful to God throughout his years, Daniel was assured by God that he would rise him from the dead and receive his portion in God's eternal kingdom. Faithfulness to God was a rich reward, not necessarily in this life, but most certainly in the life to come. So I was just going like, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's really well said.
Mhm.
That his faithfulness, he will go to his rest, and at the end of days rise to receive his allotted inheritance. Yeah. And I think this is the promise for all who are faithful, right? This is Jesus's encouragement. This is the encouragement we get from Daniel, is to stay faithful, to be wise, to follow God's way.
Mhm.
I kept noticing, especially when we were in those early chapters, about how willing Daniel was to sacrifice the elements of his culture that he would have preferred to keep to just be faithful to God. And I think, like, yeah, our citizenship is in heaven, and we're citizens of the New Jerusalem. And so any cultural preferences, whether they be in our church practices or being American or being modern Westerners or, whatever they are, I feel challenged to let that go and to just focus on faithfulness to God. What else? I thought it was touching that the angel kept giving Daniel strength. Multiple chapters we saw that. I think, like, being faithful is really hard. Where does the strength come from? And it comes from God. It's a gift. He gives it to us. Bethany, you're muted. Now go ahead.
I just glanced down and noticed that in the book of Mark, there is a section and it is titled The Abomination of Desolation.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Which, if we hadn't studied Daniel, we would be like, well, that's weird stuff.
Yeah.
Now we're still like, that's weird stuff, but it's weird stuff from Daniel.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, kind of that view of Antiochus's evil as a representative of all the evil that happens and that we see happen generation after generation. Like, it continues to happen and God continues to be in charge. Yeah. Well, anything else? I have enjoyed the study with you all very much. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for sticking through with the strangeness and the mystery. And sometimes it's good for us to have to leave things mysterious. And I've been encouraged, especially as I watch, the world be a dumpster fire, to focus on faithfulness to God. So thank you all.
Yeah.
I think that in the fall, this is not for sure yet, but it's looking pretty likely. We've had a lot of feedback, all saying the same thing, that can we do At the Table with Jesus in the fall? And so that is a series that will be out of the Gospel of Luke. It'll be about the passages where Jesus is at the table with people in the Gospel of Luke, and sort of tracing those through Jesus's teaching and his ministry. And so I am excited about that. If you want something different, now's the time to say so.
Is it a book?
But I think if we do that, it'll be very good.
Is it a book?
And then what's that?
Is it a book?
It is not a book.
Okay.
I have a book. This is a book. Come to the Table is a John Marks Hicks book. And it is actually it's called Revisioning the Lord's Supper. Come to the Table, Revisioning the Lord's Supper. It's about communion. And before he talks about communion, he says, he has a chapter that says, like, every instance of Jesus at the table in Luke points to, like, the whole purpose of his ministry in all these various ways. And so those are all background for the Lord's Supper. And I want to do a study on those ways that all the table points to the purposes of Jesus's ministry. So it's kind of out of, like, it's a slice. It's one chapter of here that I was inspired by, and you're certainly welcome. This is pretty readable. It's how academic is this? A little bit. It uses some academic words, but not a ton. So, and it's beautiful if you're interested, but it wouldn't be a study on this book. It's more like inspired by that book. Other questions?
What the Tuesday morning class can be studying?
So in the fall, it would be everybody do At the Table with Jesus, that study. Okay. The spring is the question, and I say that it's a given only because I've just gotten lots of people from both classes saying I'd love to do that. In the spring, a bunch of the Tuesday morning ladies asked if we could do church history. So what I've been doing is trying to find out from y'all, do you want to do church history, or would you rather stick with a study that's like text of scripture? I took 2 semesters of church history in my graduate program, and I got so much good out of them, different than I expected. I mean, I knew I didn't know any history and I needed to learn some, so I expected to get that out of it. But I also felt like I really understood doctrine better. I understood how different church traditions interrelate, and how, like, church practices came about. And so I found it to be very helpful. But I don't have a problem doing a Bible study for us on Wednesday night. And in fact, we could do the first half of Acts, because we did the second half of Acts, when we first started the Wednesday night study, and we've never done the first half. So we could do that. So we have good options, and I would just love feedback on what you'd like to do.
First part of Acts sounds fabulous. That's where the church began.
Yeah. What are you thinking, Paige?
Thinking that my one swipe at church history didn't last very long, but it wasn't in person. It was viewing a video that the pastor had done on a Wednesday night. So,
Well, that's the other thing about it is that this series is so my professor that I took the 2 semesters of church history from has put out a video course on church history, and it's like 14 video lessons that are half hour each. They actually range from like 18 minutes to 30. Oh, bye, Terry. Kind of range from 18 to 38 minutes. So like, and we could watch them online as a class, but that was striking me as like really kind of draining, like to do on an evening to get on. And then we would have a class discussion, it'd be like 30 minutes of video and 30 minutes of discussion. But I was like, I don't know. If it were me, would I log on to watch a video online with other people? And so
the ones I watched.
What's
your
that?
professor. I
This
did
is
enjoy
my
the ones I
professor.
watched. Yeah, of your professor, but of course it was in 3-minute increments. I have that attention span. I'm not sure.
And what did you think of them?
I enjoyed them.
Okay.
And I wanted more. But again,
right. And we would purchase it and we would have a license. So what I thought is that I might teach the same content. I have taken the extended version of the course. There should be no reason I can't just teach the same content so that we could do it interactively online. And then you would still have licensed access to the full videos if you want to watch them as well, is kind of how I'm thinking. And you all can tell me what you think about that.
Sounds good. I don't know.
Unmute yourself, Bethany. There we go.
I know. People keep coming in and out.
Yeah, I understand.
I would be very interested in that, but I'm also very interested in Bible studies as well. So my vote is whatever makes it the most easiest for you. Since you're the teacher, if you don't want to take on a different study kind of thing from
I already have Acts part 1 written because I taught it Tuesday morning, but I have learned that it still takes me quite a bit of preparation to reteach it.
Yeah.
You would
You
think
gotta
I would know it,
refresh
but
and all of that. So
yeah, but there will be some preparation in teaching it myself rather than in just showing Dr. Stenglett's videos. But I think I don't know. Get online to watch a video sounds really flat to me.
well, what are you gonna do with your Tuesday morning, ladies?
They want to do the church history. That's what why
are they doing the videos and then talking about it? Oh, okay.
Yes. But coming in person
I was gonna say they're sitting there, they can knock each other awake,
right?
Maybe
There's something
me.
more personal to be in person,
It is.
I did discover in a virtual conference last week that I pay better attention if I'm knitting, if I'm doing it virtually.
Gretchen always used to knit when I don't know if you all remember when Gretchen would come. She has since started a seminary degree, and I think that's why she doesn't have time to come anymore. But she would always knit at the same time.
I used to knit a lot.
I've never knitted. I've crocheted. Let me ask y'all. Well, let's call that a good. And then if you think more and you want to tell me, like, hey, I've been thinking about it. I think this would be neat. Like, just call me up or email or whatever, and we'll visit. And I will somehow synthesize what y'all have said and come to a decision. Okay, let's do prayer requests.
Keep the recording still.
Oh, goodness. Let me stop that. Thank you.